So, how many of you can remember when stores and movie theaters were closed on Sunday because Sunday was a day of worship? Okay. How many of you can remember when organized sports for kids would never have been played on Sunday morning because that's when families went to church? Okay? Times have changed. We now live in a post-Christendom or post-Christian world. And let me explain what I mean by that. I don't mean that Christianity is a thing of the past. I don't mean that the church is dying. I don't mean that God's kingdom is no longer advancing in the world. Here's what I do mean. If you look, I have a little slide here. The history of the church can be divided up into 3 periods. And this is very simple, very simplistic. But if you think about it, the first period is the early church. That's from its very beginning in 32 AD to 312. In that time, the church was an underground missionary movement. As such, it was persecuted. All of that changed in 313. In 313, Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome, changed its status in a heartbeat. That eventually gave rise to Christendom, by which we mean a culture in which our society, laws, education, business were dominated by the church and by Christian values. Christendom has its roots in Constantine's decision in 313, but it really got into its full swing, into its final heyday, really in the 11th century. So when we see Christianity in full swing, that's basically when the church was in control of the culture. Western Europe was known as the Holy Roman Empire. And Christendom has been in decline for at least 250 years. Many historians now call contemporary Western culture a post-Christendom culture or a post-Christian culture. Let me share a couple of signs of this transition to a post-Christian culture. Jim Griffith is a consultant who works with United Methodist Church. He grew up in Florida in the 1950s. He grew up going to church, not because his father was religious or believed in God, but because his father was a businessman. And if you wanted to do business in Florida in the 1950s, you had to go to church. Do you have to go to church to do business today? You don't, right? At least not where I've lived. Will Willimon is a retired United Methodist bishop. He says that sometime between 1960 and 1980, an old world died and a new world began. He gets even more specific. He says it was Sunday evening in 1963 in Greensville, South Carolina, when the Fox Theater opened on Sunday. He says, up until then, parents never worried if their children would grow up Christian. We were a Christian nation with Christian values. The church was the only show in town. Everything else was shut down on Sunday. There was a period not too long ago when the United Methodist Church in this country was experiencing its golden age, where the saying was true, if you build it, they will come. Take our church, for example. From 1959 to 1967, Reverend Rhodes Martin was the pastor here at KUMC. And during his tenure, there was 1 year in which nearly 300 new members were added to this church. Nearly 300 new members in 1 year. Bishop Gerald Kennedy was the bishop of our Methodist California Pacific Conference in the 1960s. Here's a picture of him from the cover of Time magazine. May 8th, 1964, cover of Time magazine, the Methodist bishop. In the 1960s, Bishop Kennedy set the following goal for our conference: to have 100 churches that had at least 1,000 members each. And he got really close to this goal. In 1968, there were 98 United Methodist churches in our conference that had a membership of over 1,000. 98. Today there are 5. Times have changed. As I like to think of it, living in a post-Christian world simply means that the church no longer has home field advantage. For a long time, the church in our country had home field advantage. Now it doesn't. So how do we respond to this change? Some Christians run around yelling, "The sky is falling." They look at the sweeping cultural changes that have taken place in our country, and they see the beginning of the end. Last month, I went to a dinner party in Honolulu, and the host of the dinner was talking about his involvement in the house church movement. For several years, he and his family stopped going to a traditional church with a church building and instead went to a church that met in someone's living room. And they did this for several years. And commenting on this experience, he said, "I think house churches are most effective in places like China, where the church is persecuted." To which someone else at this dinner party replied, "Just wait and see. In 12 years from now, that's what it will be like for the church here in America." Now, I heard this, and I thought, wow, this person actually thinks that in 12 years from now, Christians in America will face the same persecution that Christians in China face today. How is that even possible? Now, from my vantage point, yours may be different. That's kind of a sky is falling perspective. Yes, there are serious challenges to being the church in a post-Christendom world. But there are also opportunities. Opportunities to discover in a new way what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. As Kierkegaard once put it, when everyone is a Christian, no one is a Christian. So we find ourselves in uncharted waters. Yet these waters are rich with opportunity. And what we need is a guide to help us navigate them faithfully. And I want to propose that the book of Nehemiah can be that guide. I want to propose that in the story of Nehemiah, we can find our story. We can get a clear sense of who we are, where we are, and where God is taking us. I mentioned earlier that the Methodist Church had its golden age not too long ago, a time when it was thriving and powerful. Well, in the same way, the nation of Israel had its golden age. And that golden age took place between 1010 and 970 BC, when King David was in power. Under King David's leadership, Israel was unified and powerful and wealthy. The GDP and consumer index were all at, all-time highs. I mean, things were just looking great. But then things started to crack, and then splinter, and then fall apart. Over decades and centuries, things went downhill until they hit rock bottom. And the year they hit rock bottom was 587 BC. If there's one date to know from the Old Testament, it's 587 BC. That's when the Babylonians, the superpower of the day, conquered all of Judah and destroyed Jerusalem. That's when the unthinkable happened. This foreign superpower invaded, conquered the country, and then leveled the capital. Babylonian soldiers wiped out Jerusalem. They smashed the temple and the royal palace to the ground. They lit fire to the city, and then they destroyed the wall surrounding it. Then they turned the people of Jerusalem into exiles. They said, "You're coming with us. You're going to live in Babylon." They made them live as exiles, as resident aliens, as foreigners in a new land with a new culture, new language, new food, new customs. They made them live as strangers in a world where they didn't fit in. Now, it's hard to imagine Canadians doing this, but it would be like Canada invading the U.S., completely wiping out Washington, D.C., and then forcing us to go live in Quebec. Scary, right? Yeah. After 587 BC, God's people find themselves living as exiles in a strange land. To be an exile is to be different from the people around you, to have different values, to be on the outside looking in, to no longer have home field advantage. And for many followers of Christ, living in a post-Christian world is akin to living as an exile. Now, I'm new to Hawaii, so I'm still just learning the cultural dynamics here. But when I was in San Diego, I definitely had exile moments where I realized as a follower of Jesus, I didn't fit in. One of these came when we enrolled our son, Micah, in school, in kindergarten. He went to a public charter school, had 2 kindergartens. And at the school, the way they decided which student was be in which class is the 2 kindergarten teachers got together with this other committee from the school, and they basically divided up the students. And I know someone who was on the committee, so she told me what happened. But as they were discussing this, they came to Micah, and someone happened to mention, oh, his dad is a pastor. And one of the kindergarten teachers basically said, no way can he be in my class. Like, the idea of having to relate to a pastor was so threatening for this kindergarten teacher that he wanted Micah in a different class. Now, I heard this, and I have to say I just laughed. Because I just thought, wow, pastors are the new radicals. We are now the folks people are scared of. I mean, I can take anyone. Well, pastor, no. Whoa, his son. Over there, please. Times have changed. The book of Nehemiah takes place during the exile, during a time when God's people had lost much of their power and prestige. And as such, it speaks to us today and shows us what it looks like as exiles in a post-Christian world to build for a new future. So this morning, as we kick off this series, we're going to do a 6-week series on Nehemiah. As we kick off this series, I want to offer a quick introduction to the book of Nehemiah. As we can see from our children up here, we may have some new things to learn about the book of Nehemiah so that we know the who, the what, the where, the when of this account. And then I want to close by sharing a key theme from the book that I think really speaks to us today. So first, some history. And it's really important to recognize that this is history. When we study Nehemiah, we're not reading the manuscript of a Disney movie. We're looking at a real account of real people who lived in a real place. In fact, here's a picture from present-day Jerusalem. And according to archaeologists, this is a portion of the wall that Nehemiah built in 445 BC. It's located on the east side of Jerusalem, just below the palace. And the upper portions of this wall were rebuilt by the Hasmoneans. But we can actually see today this history. It's still alive. We can see something that Nehemiah and his fellow exiles did. If you look inside your worship program, if you turn to the back, you'll see a map and a basic timeline, because I know this is new to virtually all of us. So we provided a really simple map and a basic timeline that will help us better understand this history. So here's what happened. As I mentioned before, in 587 BC, that's the key date that kind of comes before all of this. The Babylonians conquered Judah, forced the Jewish people into exile in Babylon, which you can see on your map, right? You can see Babylon there on just the right-hand side of your map. About 50 years later, in 538 BC, a new superpower rose up, the Persians. And the Persians conquered the Babylonians. They said, hey, take that, bam. You've been conquering other nations, now you're down. New superpower on the block, the Persians. And when the Persians came into power, their king, King Cyrus, told the Jewish people, you can return to Judah. You can go back to Jerusalem. You don't have to stay here in Babylon any longer. Now, most of the Jews didn't want to return to Jerusalem. They had established businesses and farms in Babylon. They had settled down. But a small group returned to Jerusalem with a particular goal in mind, to rebuild the temple. And we learn about their story in the book of Ezra, which comes right before the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. Now, with the help of King Cyrus, the exiles who returned home, they start rebuilding the temple. And they complete this rebuilding project in 516 BC. And slowly but surely, the city of Jerusalem comes back to life. Now, we go fast forward a little bit. We fast forward to 464 BC. A new Persian king comes into power, King Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes gives permission for a new group of exiles to leave Babylon and to go back to Jerusalem. And this group is led by Ezra. And they arrive in Jerusalem in 458 BC, as you can see on your timeline. Now, once Ezra arrives in Jerusalem, he pulls together the board of trustees and he says, folks, we need to rebuild the wall around the city. So a work party is set up, snacks are provided, and they begin rebuilding the wall. However, some of the surrounding nations don't like this work party. They don't like this project. They don't want Jerusalem restored. They don't want the Israelites reestablishing their identity and community. So these other nations send a letter to King Artaxerxes. And in this letter they say, you may not know this, but these folks are trouble. If you let them rebuild their city and their wall, they're going to rebel against you. They're going to stop paying taxes, and your revenue stream is going to dry up. If you allow this city to be rebuilt and its walls restored, you will be left with nothing in this region. So when King Artaxerxes gets this letter, he replies to these other nations, okay, then you have my authority to do whatever it takes to stop this rebuilding. And that's what these other nations do. According to Ezra 4, the exile work party is promptly crushed by force and power. The city wall is in shambles once again. That's the backstory that brings us to the book of Nehemiah. When the book of Nehemiah opens, the year is 446 BC. It's November or December of that year. The city is Susa, which was the winter resort of the Persian kings, which you can see on the far right-hand side of your map. Nehemiah did not live in Rome. Nehemiah lived in Susa, which is right on the Persian Gulf in modern-day Iran. And the author of this book, Nehemiah, is a Jewish exile who happens to be the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. Now, a cupbearer was actually a high-level government official. The cupbearer tasted all the wine before it got to the king to make sure it was safe to drink. Some of you are like, that sounds like a good job. I'll take that job. But, that meant that the cupbearer had regular contact with the king, a lot of contact with the king, and was in the king's inner circle. So here's Nehemiah in Susa, along the Persian Gulf, working directly for King Artaxerxes, and some fellow Jews show up having just returned from Jerusalem. And Nehemiah asked them, hey, how are things going with the exiles who've survived? How's Jerusalem? How's our homeland? Not good at all, they tell him. The exiles who've returned home, they are in serious trouble and disgrace. The wall around Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. And when Nehemiah hears this news, he sits down and weeps. And then for several days, he mourns and fasts and prays. This is how the stage is set for the book of Nehemiah. And next week, we're going to look at Nehemiah's response to this news. But today, I want to close by looking at one of the greatest challenges exiles face, both in Nehemiah's day and in ours. It's this: the temptation for exiles is to get discouraged. For those who remember what Jerusalem looked like in all its splendor, it's heartbreaking to see it fall apart. It's discouraging to recognize how much times have changed when that change involves loss. And that's particularly true for exiles because they no longer have the influence and the resources they once had. When they gathered together all the exiles that returned back to Jerusalem, over all the time period where that was taking place, it's estimated that in total, only 50,000 exiles returned to Jerusalem. 50,000. Jerusalem was once the great city of David, a thriving capital. Now it only has a remnant of 50,000 people. And when those 50,000 people looked around at the city and knew what it once was, they must have felt really small. They no longer have the money they used to have. They no longer have the people power they used to have. They no longer have the influence they used to have. You put all that together, and the temptation for exiles is to get discouraged. And I got to tell you, there are times when I feel that. There are times when I look around at the Methodist Church and think, it would have been nice to serve during Bishop Kennedy's time. Like, what would that have been like? The church I served in San Diego averaged over 400 in worship at one point in the 60s. When I arrived as pastor, it averaged just under 70. And I remember one day walking around the church facility with someone who had just joined the board of trustees. And the board of trustees are the folks who oversee the facilities in a Methodist church. And as we walked around looking at these buildings that were built in 1925, this is our church in San Diego, this person said to me, Tim, it would take at least $1 million to do all the improvements that should be done here. And I said to him, yeah, that's probably about right, knowing that the trustees' annual budget was $10,000. The temptation for exiles is to get discouraged. But here's what we discover in the book of Nehemiah. The good news for exiles is that God restores. Our God is a God who restores. It's kind of funny when you think about it. There are only 2 chapters in the Bible about God creating. Genesis 1 and 2. Every chapter after that is about God restoring. Our God is a God who restores, who rebuilds, who repairs that which is broken. That's what we see in the book of Nehemiah. In chapters 1 through 7, God restores the community physically. In chapters 8 through 13, God restores the community spiritually. Both the physical dimension and the spiritual dimension matter, and our God is a God who restores both. So whether we face a broken wall, or a broken window, or a broken parking lot, or a broken relationship with God, or a broken relationship with a family member, or a broken situation at work, or a broken dream, let us remember that God restores. That is good news, especially for exiles living in a post-Christian world. Amen.